It was the busiest Friday night Ember Room had seen all month. Every table was full, the low lighting warm against polished stone walls, and the hum of quiet conversation filled the room, like something carefully maintained. Then Cassandra Hale stood up, slammed her spoon against the table, and pointed directly at the man walking out from the open kitchen. Her voice cut clean through every conversation in the room. "You're rude. Leave the restaurant. Right now." No one moved. The man in the white apron looked back at her, calm, unbothered, and completely silent. Cassandra had no idea she had just ordered the owner to leave his own restaurant. Graham Cole was not a man who needed to be seen. That was the first thing anyone who worked at Ember Room learned, usually within their first week. He arrived before the morning delivery trucks checked the produce himself, and was already standing at the stove by the time the prep cooks came in. He didn't call attention to himself. He didn't need to. The food did what words couldn't, and that was exactly the arrangement he preferred. Most of the staff had worked at the restaurant for over a year before they even understood who he really was. And by then it no longer felt like a secret. It just felt like Graham. He had turned 36 that past winter, though no one at the restaurant made much of it. He was the kind of man whose age didn't seem to accumulate on his face the way it did for most people. Not because life had been easy, but because he had learned very early how to carry weight without wearing it. His hair was dark, with the first hints of gray coming in at the sides. His hands were the hands of someone who had been working with them since before he was old enough to understand why. He moved through the kitchen the way water moves through a familiar channel, without hesitation, without waste. Before Ember Room, there had been Cole Hospitality Group. His father had built it, and Graham had helped grow it into one of the more respected mid-market dining brands in the Midwest. 12 locations, a loyal following, and a name that showed up in the right trade publications. Then his wife Rachel died on a Tuesday morning in early November, on a stretch of interstate outside of Indianapolis, in the kind of accident that leaves no room for preparation or negotiation. She was 31. Graham shut the business down within 18 months, not because it failed, but because he couldn't stand the idea of running something that large and that loud anymore. He needed somewhere quiet to put his hands. Ember Room was that place. It sat on the ground floor of a narrow building in the West Loop, with no sign out front, except a small brass plate engraved with the name. It seated 42 people. There was a waiting list for reservations that stretched out nearly 3 months, not because Graham had advertised or courted press, but because the food was genuinely unlike anything else in Chicago. And in a city that took food seriously, that kind of reputation moved on its own. He kept his name off the website, off the menu, off every printed thing associated with the restaurant. To the public, Ember Room had no known owner. That was exactly how Graham wanted it. Most nights, he worked the line himself, not because he couldn't afford to hire someone, but because the act of cooking the specific physical focus it required was the only thing that had consistently kept him on the right side of his own grief. He didn't talk about Rachel. He didn't display her photograph anywhere in the restaurant. But every dish on the menu had a logic to it that came from something she had said, or believed, or loved, and that was enough for him. It was private, and it was sufficient. Derek, the front-of-house manager, had been with Graham since the beginning. He was a compact, efficient man in his early 40s, with the practiced calm of someone who had managed difficult rooms for most of his adult life. He knew every regular by name, remembered dietary restrictions without being reminded, and had a particular talent for defusing tension before it became visible. He was the face of Ember Room in every public-facing sense. When guests asked who owned the restaurant, Derek smiled and said the ownership preferred to remain private. That was usually enough to satisfy curiosity. Usually. Cassandra Hale had signed the term sheet at 4:17 that afternoon. $40 million in Series B, funding for a logistics automation startup that her firm had been tracking for 8 months, and the deal had closed on her terms, on her timeline, exactly as she had structured it from the beginning. Her assistant had already sent the congratulatory bottle of champagne to the startup's CEO before Cassandra's car had left the parking structure. She didn't celebrate by lingering. She celebrated by moving to the next thing. She was 29, though most people who encountered her in a professional context assumed she was older, not from her appearance, but from the quality of her attention. She listened the way that people who have already made up their minds listen, completely present and entirely unreachable. Her company, Hale Ventures, had been built over 7 years from a Series A fund she had raised at 22 with no connections, and a deck that her first 2 investors had initially dismissed. She didn't forgive that easily. She also didn't forget. By the time her car pulled up outside Ember Room at 7:45, she had been in meetings or on calls for 11 consecutive hours. She had not eaten since a working lunch that had consisted mostly of coffee and a few bites of something her assistant had left on her desk. Her mood, which had started the day at controlled and functional, had spent the last several hours trending downward, and the deal closing had not improved it as much as she had expected. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from winning things, and she had stopped finding it surprising. She had not made a reservation. One of her associates had mentioned Ember Room 3 weeks earlier as the most impossible table in the city, and Cassandra had filed that away the way she filed most information, not as a challenge exactly, but as something to be tested. She didn't call ahead because calling ahead felt like accommodation, and accommodation was something other people did. Derek met her at the door with the kind of professional warmth that communicated no immediately. Every table was occupied. There was a reservation-only policy, and the next available booking was in 8 weeks. Cassandra looked past him into the dining room, the low amber light, the quiet clink of glasses, the composed, almost architectural stillness of the room, and said she would wait. Derek told her the wait could be significant. She said she understood. She sat at the small bar near the entrance and ordered sparkling water and spent 35 minutes doing exactly what she did everywhere, evaluating the room, cataloging every detail, and finding it insufficient. The bar chairs were uncomfortable. The music was too sparse. The wait was unreasonable for someone who had closed a $40 million deal 4 hours ago. None of these observations improved her state of mind. When a table finally opened, a two-top, near the kitchen pass, that had been vacated by a couple leaving early, Derek offered it to her, with the same practiced warmth. She sat down without acknowledging the gesture as unusual. The menu at Ember Room did not look the way Cassandra expected it to look. There were no elaborate descriptions, no ingredient sourcing paragraphs, no language designed to perform sophistication. Each dish was named plainly and briefly roasted root vegetables with aged butter, dry-aged beef with charred leek-preserved citrus sorbet. The prices were by any measure exceptional. The understatement of the menu against the weight of those prices irritated her before the food had even arrived. When her main course came, it was a piece of seared duck breast, rested and sliced, arranged over a reduction that was the color of dark mahogany. There were 3 small roasted figs alongside it, a scattering of fresh thyme, and nothing else on the plate. It was restrained to the point of severity. Cassandra cut into the duck, ate 1 bite, and set her fork down. The technique was not the issue. The issue was that this was the most talked about restaurant in Chicago, and the plate in front of her looked like something she could have ordered at a dozen other places. She had waited 40 minutes for a table she hadn't booked, paid the kind of prices that implied an experience she wasn't having, and the whole evening felt like a negotiation she hadn't agreed to enter. She flagged down the nearest server and said she wanted to speak with someone about the food. That someone turned out to be Graham. He came out of the kitchen the way he always did, without ceremony, wiping his hands on the side of his apron, moving at the same pace he moved when he was plating, or tasting, or adjusting a sauce. He was not performing calm. He was simply calm. He stopped at her table, introduced himself by first name only, and asked what the concern was. Cassandra told him. The dish was underwhelming. For this price point at this reputation, she had expected something that justified the experience. The presentation was minimal to the point of being dismissive. She had eaten at restaurants across 3 continents, and what was in front of her did not belong in the same conversation. Graham listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he explained quietly and directly that the duck had been dry-aged for 5 days and seared in clarified butter rendered from a local dairy. The reduction had been built over 3 hours from bones and aromatics. The figs were from a small farm in Michigan that delivered twice weekly. Nothing on the plate was decorative. Everything on the plate was there because it contributed to what he wanted the dish to taste like. And the simplicity was not an accident. It was the whole point. He said this without apology and without inflection, the way someone explains a decision they made deliberately and stands behind completely. Cassandra heard all of it and came to a different conclusion. He was talking at her the way people talked when they didn't think the person they were addressing was worth a different approach. The flatness in his voice, the absence of any attempt to soften or impress, she read it as contempt. As someone who had spent years in rooms where men underestimated her, she had a finely calibrated sensitivity to that particular texture of dismissal, and she was certain she was feeling it now. She told him the explanation didn't change her assessment of the dish. Then she told him his manner was unacceptable. Graham said he was sorry she felt that way. That was when Cassandra stood up. The room had been at its fullest point of the evening. Every table occupied the low murmur of 42 people managing the particular kind of conversation that fine dining encourages, where everything feels slightly more significant than it probably is. The sound of her spoon hitting the table reached every corner of the room before anyone fully understood what was happening. She pointed directly at Graham and said it loudly, clearly, with the full confidence of someone who had never had this kind of moment go badly for them. "You're rude. Leave the restaurant. Right now." Then she turned toward Derek, who was already moving from the far end of the room, and told him she expected this person to be removed from the floor immediately. Derek stopped walking. He didn't speak. No one on the staff moved. The servers near the kitchen pass stayed where they were. The sommelier, who had been mid-pour at the next table, straightened, but didn't step forward. The entire room had gone to that particular kind of quiet that happens when people are trying very hard to seem like they aren't watching something. Graham reached up and untied his apron. Strings folded the apron once over his forearm and looked at Cassandra with an expression that had not changed since she stood up. When he spoke, his voice was the same volume it had been the entire conversation. Low, unhurried, and entirely in control. "If you want me to leave my restaurant," Graham said, "then I think we should speak privately first." Cassandra's response formed in her throat and stopped there. She heard the words again, arranged them differently. Looked at the staff who had not moved, looked at Derek, who had not moved, and understood in the way that certain realizations arrive, not gradually, but all at once, without warning or mercy, that she had made a significant error in reading the situation. Graham Cole was not the chef. He was not an employee she could have removed. He was not a man she had any power over in this building or in this specific conversation. The restaurant she was standing in the table, she had waited 40 minutes for the 42 people now very carefully not looking at her. All of it belonged to him. Derek, standing at the edge of the room with his hands folded and his expression professionally neutral, said nothing. There was nothing to say. The correction had already been made by the only person in the room who had the standing to make it. Cassandra Hale sat back down. The hum of conversation around the room resumed within about 30 seconds, the way it does when people decide collectively that the most dignified thing is to pretend an awkward thing has resolved itself. But Cassandra didn't reach for her fork. She sat with her hands flat on the table, her face arranged into something that was not quite composure, and tried to locate the edge of a situation she had for the first time in a very long time completely misread. Graham set his folded apron on the pass and walked back into the kitchen without looking at her again. The kitchen doors swung once and were still. The city beyond the windows kept moving. Inside Ember Room, 42 people returned to their meals, and Cassandra Hale sat alone at a table near the kitchen pass and understood with a clarity she hadn't asked for that she had just done something she could not undo in a room full of people who had all seen her do it. The video was 47 seconds long. Someone at a nearby table had captured it on their phone, the spoon hitting the table. Cassandra standing the point of her finger, the words delivered with the full weight of someone who had never once considered that a room might not respond the way she expected. The clip had been uploaded before she'd even finished her water and settled the check. By midnight, it had been viewed 200,000 times. By the following morning, it had crossed 1 million. And Cassandra's name was attached to a trending conversation that had nothing to do with venture capital. The comments were not kind. They used words like entitled and delusional and a dozen other things that her PR team immediately began documenting in a shared file. The framing that took hold fastest was also the most damaging: a wealthy executive publicly humiliating a line cook. That was how most people read it, because that was most of what the video showed. Graham's response, the apron, the quiet correction, appeared in only the final 4 seconds of the clip, and many people didn't watch that far. By 9 in the morning, Cassandra was in a conference room on the 31st floor of her firm's building, with her communications director, her legal counsel, and 2 board members who had driven in specifically for the meeting. The board members were not angry, which was almost worse. They were measured and deliberate in the way that people are when they're deciding how much of a problem something is going to become. One of them, a man named Warren Briggs, who had been on her board since the Series A, told her that the firm's institutional investors had already been in contact with questions about reputational exposure. He didn't editorialize. He didn't have to. Cassandra's communications director, a woman named Sandra Reeves, who had managed crisis response for 3 different Fortune 500 companies before joining Hale Ventures, laid out 3 response options: a written statement expressing regret for the incident, a recorded video apology distributed through the firm's social channels, or a direct outreach to the restaurant and the individual involved. Each option came with a projected timeline for news cycle turnover. Sandra presented all 3 with equal detachment and waited. Cassandra looked at the options and felt for the first time in several years that she was working with incomplete information about her own situation, because Graham Cole had still said nothing. No statement, no interview request, no legal correspondence, no public comment of any kind. The restaurant's social accounts, which had never been particularly active, had posted nothing since the incident. Derek had reportedly told 2 different journalists who showed up at the door that the restaurant had no comment and that reservations remained open as scheduled. The silence from Ember Room was not the silence of someone preparing a response. It was the silence of someone who had decided the entire conversation was beneath them. And that was the part Cassandra couldn't place, or manage, or predict. She told Sandra she would handle the outreach to the restaurant herself. Sandra wrote that down without expression. She called Derek's number, the only contact information publicly associated with Ember Room, on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the incident. Derek answered on the second ring, and when she identified herself, there was a brief moment where neither of them said anything, and then Derek said he would pass along her request. She asked if she could speak with Graham directly. Derek said he would pass along her request. She recognized the repetition as intentional and left it alone. Graham called her back the following morning at 7:40, which she suspected was not an accident in terms of timing. His voice on the phone was the same as it had been in the restaurant flat, direct, without warmth or hostility. He told her he was willing to meet. She said she appreciated that, and the word came out slightly more formal than she intended, the way words do when you're working to maintain a composure that isn't entirely stable. They met at the restaurant on a Saturday before service, when the room was empty and the kitchen was running prep. Graham sat across from her at a table near the window with a cup of black coffee and no notes or agenda, and Cassandra arrived with a prepared position that included a financial settlement figure, a public statement that had been reviewed by 3 people, and a timeline. She had prepared for a negotiation because negotiation was the framework she trusted. Graham didn't negotiate. He listened to what she had laid out, drank his coffee, and told her that he didn't want a settlement. and he wasn't interested in a statement. What he wanted, he said, was for her to work in the restaurant for 1 week. Full shifts, floor and kitchen, under the same conditions as every other member of his staff. He said it without particular emphasis, as though it were the obvious solution to an obvious problem, and waited for her response. Cassandra's response took a moment to form. She asked him to clarify what he meant by that. He clarified it exactly as he had stated it the first time. She asked what the purpose was. He said she had made a public judgment about his staff, his food, and the value of the work done in that building. He thought it was reasonable that before anything else happened, she understand what that work actually was. Then, if she still wanted to issue a statement, or make some other arrangement, they could discuss it. He wasn't issuing an ultimatum, he was making a request, and the particular way he made it without pressure, without leverage, without any apparent interest in whether she said yes or no, was what made it impossible to dismiss. She said yes because she didn't have a better option, and because every alternative available to her was worse. She told herself it was a strategic concession, not a genuine one. She was very good at telling herself useful things. She started on a Monday in a white button-down and dark trousers that she changed for the spare uniform Nora handed her, without ceremony, black pants, a black shirt, a short apron. Nora was the senior waitstaff, a woman in her mid-30s with dark red hair pulled back tight, and the kind of efficiency that came from doing something very well for a very long time. She showed Cassandra how the tables were set, explained the reservation flow, walked her through the point-of-sale system in about 4 minutes, and then moved on to her own work, without asking if there were questions. There weren't, because Cassandra had decided she wasn't going to ask questions. She was going to observe and perform, and finish the week, and be done with it. By the end of the first service, she had dropped a water glass, misread a table's dietary restrictions, and sent the wrong dish to a guest with a shellfish allergy caught fortunately by Nora before it reached the table, and forgotten to enter a modification on a dessert order that had to be remade. She had also been on her feet for 6 hours in shoes that were not designed for 6 consecutive hours of movement, and her lower back was making an argument she hadn't anticipated. She said nothing about any of it, and drove herself home at 11:45. The staff didn't trust her. They were professional about it, which was almost identical to how they'd act if they simply didn't trust her. So the distinction was mostly internal. Nora was efficient and direct, and offered correction without inflection whenever correction was needed, but there was no ease in it, no warmth extended in the way. Warmth sometimes extends between people working in close proximity under pressure. The kitchen staff acknowledged her when necessary, and otherwise worked around her the way people work around a new variable they haven't finished evaluating. She understood all of this, and found it neither surprising nor comfortable. Graham worked the line every service that week. He didn't speak to Cassandra directly, unless work required it, and when he did, he was precise and economical, the same way he'd been on the phone, the same way he'd been at the table during their meeting. He was not cold toward her exactly. He was consistent. She realized somewhere around the 3rd day that he was the same with everyone with Nora, with the prep cooks with Derek, when he came back to check on something. That consistency wasn't a performance. It was just who he was, and it made the interaction she'd had with him on the first night the one she'd read, as contempt, feel suddenly less certain in her memory. She started paying attention to the details she had dismissed on that first evening. The way the kitchen ran with almost no raised voices, despite the volume and the pace. The way Graham tasted every dish before it went out, not as a formality, but with the specific focus of someone who was still actually listening to what the food was telling him. The way the prep cook named Marcus, a quiet man in his late 20s, who arrived first and left last, handled his station with a kind of concentration that belonged to someone who cared about the outcome, in a way that had nothing to do with recognition. These were people who worked 14 hours in a hot room for tables that would never know their names, and the quality of their attention to the work did not diminish because of that anonymity. Cassandra had spent 7 years building a company by understanding value where it existed, what it was worth, how to move it. She had been wrong in this building in this week about almost every assessment she had made. That was not a comfortable thing to understand about herself. On the fourth evening, she was wiping down tables after service, when Nora stopped beside her and said not unkindly that she'd handled the dessert modification correctly for the last 2 nights. It was a small thing. It was also the first unreserved thing anyone on the staff had said to her since Monday. Cassandra said thank you and meant it in a way she hadn't expected to mean it. It was Derek who mentioned Rachel not as a disclosure, but in passing on a Thursday morning when Cassandra had arrived early, and the two of them were doing a walk-through of the floor before prep began. He didn't offer it as explanation or as something she was owed. He mentioned it the way someone mentions a thing that is simply true and present the way weather is present, because he had worked alongside Graham long enough that it was just part of the shape of the place. He told her that Graham had been a different kind of operator before, that he'd run something much larger, and that after he lost his wife, he had let all of that go and built Ember Room instead. Derek said it matter-of-factly and moved on to the reservation count, and Cassandra didn't ask a follow-up question. She thought about it through the morning service. She thought about what it cost to build something the size of Cole Hospitality Group, and what it cost to walk away from it, and what it meant that the thing Graham had built afterward was this 42 seats, no sign, no public name attached to it. She thought about what Rachel must have been to him for the loss of her, to reorganize his entire life at the structural level. She thought about all the things she owned and had access to, and could leverage or convert or deploy, and she thought about how none of that would have been sufficient in that situation. Not $1 of it. Not one relationship or resource or advantage. And for a woman who had organized most of her adult life around the principle that sufficient resources solved sufficient problems, that was a genuinely disorienting thing to sit with. She was still sitting with it on Friday afternoon when Tyler Marsh published his piece. Tyler Marsh ran a media blog that occupied a particular niche, not quite tabloid, not quite legitimate journalism, but with enough of a following and enough occasional accuracy that the mainstream outlets watched it and sometimes followed its leads. He had spent the week apparently doing what Cassandra's own communications team had not managed to do, tracing the ownership of Ember Room back through its LLC structure, cross-referencing Graham's name with old trade publications from the Cole Hospitality years, and then pulling the accident report from the Indiana State Police records, which were public and which contained Rachel's name and the specifics of how she had died. Marsh published all of it with the headline positioned to imply that the viral incident had revealed a secret recluse with a tragic past, and the piece had the kind of specific detail that made it difficult to dismiss as speculation. By the following morning, Saturday, there were 2 news vans parked outside Ember Room. By early afternoon, there were 4 and a photographer who had stationed himself across the street. Derek fielded 11 media calls before noon and responded to none of them. Graham arrived at the restaurant at his usual time, went through the usual pre-service routine, and said nothing to anyone about the coverage. He closed the restaurant that evening before the first table had been seated, not for the night, for the foreseeable future. He told Derek first quietly while the kitchen was still in prep, and Derek received it the way he received most things Graham told him without argument, with a single nod and a specific kind of stillness that meant he understood what it had cost to say. Graham then addressed the full staff briefly. Before they dispersed, Nora Marcus, the 2 line cooks, who had been with him since the beginning, the sommelier, and the server who covered the back section. He told them their positions were secure and that he would be in touch about timeline, and thanked them for their work without elaborating further. He didn't perform distress. He didn't explain his reasoning in detail. He had built Ember Room specifically to be the one place that belonged to him in a way nothing else could touch, and now that was no longer true. And that was the end of it. Cassandra was in the dining room when he made the announcement. She had come in that Saturday evening expecting to finish her final shift of the week, and instead, she stood with the rest of the staff in the quiet of a room that was about to go dark for reasons she had set in motion with 47 seconds of footage that had existed in the world before she understood what she was pointing at. She didn't say anything because there was nothing she could say in that room in front of those people that would have been adequate. Nora left without looking at her. Marcus gathered his knives and his bag and walked out through the kitchen without a word. Derek began turning off the dining room lights in the systematic way he always did after service, even though there had been no service, because Derek was a man who completed procedures regardless of the circumstances, and watching him do it in a room that was about to close indefinitely was the most specific form of loss Cassandra had witnessed in a very long time. Graham was the last one out of the kitchen. He stopped when he reached the dining room and saw that she was still there. He looked at her with that same expression, the one she still hadn't been able to fully categorize, and then he picked up his coat from the hook behind the bar and walked toward the door. Cassandra said his name. He stopped but didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his face was tired, in a way she hadn't seen before. Not angry, not accusatory, just tired the way someone looks when they've run out of the energy required to protect a thing they care about. "I'm sorry," she said. It came out without a communication strategy behind it. Just the words, plain in a room that was already half dark. Graham looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I know." He pushed the door open and walked out, and the door swung shut behind him, and the lock clicked, and Ember Room went dark. The week after Ember Room closed, Cassandra did something she almost never did. She stopped moving. Not completely, and not for long. Her calendar didn't allow for anything resembling genuine stillness, but there were hours, specifically in the early mornings, before her assistant arrived, and before the first calls began, where she sat at the window of her apartment on the 24th floor and looked out at the city and didn't reach for her phone. She had spent 7 years building Hale Ventures on the premise that information was leverage and speed was advantage, and both of those instincts were failing her in a way she couldn't engineer around. She knew the precise financial exposure the firm was facing. She knew the talking points her communications team had prepared. She knew exactly how many days the current news cycle had before something else displaced it. What she didn't know was how to want the right thing for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy. That was the problem she kept returning to. Sandra had drafted a media statement that tested well in the focus group she'd run, sympathetic, measured appropriately contrite, without being self-flagellating. The language was tight. The framing was careful. Every sentence had been engineered to land without opening new liability. It was a very good statement, and every time Cassandra read it, she felt something she could only describe as a specific kind of wrongness, the kind that comes from knowing that a technically correct answer is still a dishonest one. She thought about Nora leaving without looking at her. She thought about Marcus and his knives and the way he had walked out of that kitchen with the quiet dignity of someone who had not been given a reason to perform his feelings. She thought about Derek turning off the lights in a room that hadn't served anyone that night, completing a routine that no longer had a purpose, because that was what you did when you respected a place enough to close it properly. She thought about Graham in the doorway, coat in hand, tired in a way that money and position could not address, and the 2 words he'd said to her, "I know," that had been neither forgiveness nor accusation, and had somehow been more unsettling than either. The statement Sandra had drafted did not account for any of those things. It accounted for the firm, for the investors, for the news cycle for the quarter ahead. It was a document about Cassandra Hale, the executive, written to protect Cassandra Hale, the executive, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the person who had stood in a darkened restaurant and said she was sorry, and meant it in a way she hadn't planned to mean anything that evening. She called Sandra on a Tuesday and told her to cancel the statement. Sandra asked what they were replacing it with. Cassandra said she would handle it directly. She booked a room at a downtown hotel conference space for Thursday morning and sent media invitations through her firm's press contact the day before. The invitation said only that Cassandra Hale would be making a personal statement regarding the recent incident at Ember Room, and that no questions would be taken. Sandra received a copy of the invitation at the same time as the press contacts, which was how Cassandra managed the situation by not giving anyone on her team the opportunity to review or redirect what she was about to do. Warren Briggs called her that evening. She let it go to voicemail. 11 journalists showed up along with 4 cameras and a handful of people with phones who had seen the invite circulate online. The room was not large. Cassandra stood at a single podium, without notes, without a communications team seated behind her, without anything that would suggest the statement had been workshopped or prepared by committee. She was wearing the same dark blazer she'd worn to close the Series B deal the evening the incident had happened, not as a deliberate choice, but because she had reached for it without thinking, and then had noticed and decided to leave it on. It felt honest in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone else. She told the room that she had behaved badly. Not that there had been a regrettable incident. Not that all parties had contributed to a misunderstanding. Not that she had reacted in a way that didn't reflect her values, the specific language her team had cycled through in various drafts over the past 2 weeks. She said she had walked into a room that belonged to someone else, and had spoken to him as though his work and his judgment were beneath her consideration in front of a room full of people, because she was tired and frustrated, and had not once considered whether her assumptions about him were accurate. She said the people who worked in that restaurant, the servers, the prep, cooks, the kitchen staff who worked 14 hours a day, and whose names never appeared anywhere deserved better than to have their workplace turned into a backdrop for someone else's bad evening. She said that she had spent a week working in that restaurant at Graham Cole's request, and that it had been the most instructive professional experience she'd had in years, and that she was saying that without irony. She did not mention Rachel. She did not mention the Tyler Marsh piece or the closure of the restaurant. She did not ask for anything, and she did not position the statement as the resolution to a problem. She said what was true, and then she stepped back from the podium and left the room, and the cameras followed her out, and then didn't, because there was nothing left to capture. The clip from the press conference ran that afternoon. By evening, it had more views than the original 47-second video. The response was not uniformly positive. It never was for anything but the dominant register of the conversation shifted, and that shift was not manufactured. It had the texture of something genuine, which was the only thing that traveled faster than outrage. Cassandra drove home alone, made coffee, and sat at the window again. She felt no particular relief, and she had not expected to. What she felt was closer to alignment, the specific quiet sensation of having done a thing for the right reason at the cost of a certain amount of control and finding that the cost was manageable. She hadn't known that about herself before. She had suspected it maybe, but suspicion wasn't the same as knowing. Derek called her on Friday morning. He told her that Nora had spoken to the staff the previous evening, all of them, the servers and the prep cooks, and Marcus, and the line cooks, and the sommelier. Every person who had worked that final Saturday, when the dining room went dark, and that they had together asked for Graham's address, which Derek had given them, and that they had gone there. He said this with his characteristic absence of editorial comment, reporting the sequence of events as though reading from a log, but there was something underneath it that she could hear, a specific quality of not hiding that felt like its own kind of endorsement. Cassandra asked how that had gone. Derek said he didn't know the specifics, that he hadn't been there, but that he had spoken to Graham that morning, and that Graham had asked him to call her. She understood, without Derek needing to state it explicitly, that the call itself was the message that Graham reaching out through Derek at this particular moment meant something had shifted. She asked if the restaurant was going to reopen. Derek said he believed so. Yes. Then he said in the same measured tone he used for everything that Graham had asked, whether she might come by the restaurant the following morning before service, if service was resuming, to speak with him. He said, Graham had been specific about the timing, before service, not after. She understood that too. It meant something was being offered, in a context that was still his, still on his terms, still in the frame of the work rather than outside it. She said yes. She arrived at Ember Room at 8:15 on Saturday morning. The brass plate by the door was still there. The small lights in the window were on which they hadn't been since the closure, and through the glass she could see the room chairs, down tables, set the low amber warmth of the space doing what it always did, regardless of who was present. Graham opened the door. He was in his chef's jacket, not the apron pre-service the way she'd learned to read the timeline of the restaurant's day. He looked less tired than he had the last time she'd seen him, though not entirely rested the way someone looks when they've made a decision and are still carrying the weight of what the decision cost, but are no longer fighting it. He stepped back to let her in without preamble. They sat at the same table near the window, where they'd had their first real conversation, the one where he'd offered her the week and she'd come in with a settlement figure and left without using it. There was coffee already on the table. She wrapped both hands around the mug and didn't try to manage the opening of the conversation. Graham told her that the staff had come to his apartment on Thursday night, all of them standing in the hallway of his building with their coats on, and Nora had told him without apparent embarrassment that they were not finished working at the restaurant, and that he did not have the right to take it from them because someone else had made a mess of his private life. He said it with a faint quality in his voice that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it, the tone of someone who has been surprised by something they couldn't have predicted, and found the surprise more useful than they expected. Cassandra said it sounded like something Nora would do. Graham said yes, it did. She asked him if he was actually going to reopen. He said he was. He said he had spent the better part of 2 weeks trying to locate a version of the situation where closing permanently was a decision he was making from a position of choice, and he had concluded with some assistance from the people who wouldn't leave his hallway that it wasn't. He was closing because he was afraid of what it meant to stay open in a world that now knew his name and his history and had an opinion about both. And being afraid of something was not a reason he was willing to accept for giving up the one thing he had built entirely for the right reasons. He said it plainly without the careful flatness he usually maintained, and Cassandra understood that this was the version of him that existed underneath the consistency, the man who had built and lost and built again, and was now deciding clearly and without theater that he was not done. She didn't say anything in response because the moment didn't need commentary. She just nodded, and he picked up his coffee, and for a few minutes, they sat in the quiet of the room without filling it. Then Graham said something she hadn't expected. He told her that the press conference had been well done. Not kind, not generous well done in the tone of someone assessing craft. He said he had watched it twice, which she also hadn't expected, and that he could tell the difference between a statement that had been constructed to manage a situation and a statement that had been made because the person making it needed to say the thing out loud. He said hers had been the second kind. She said she knew. He said that was the point, that knowing the difference, and then doing it anyway, was the harder thing, and she had done it anyway. She told him she had learned what she could do without a communications team standing behind her. He said that was a reasonable thing to learn. Ember Room reopened on a Wednesday 3 weeks after it had closed. The reservation list, which Derek had maintained without being asked to during the closure, had accumulated a backlog of nearly 2 months. Several of the people on that list had added notes when they rebooked brief things a line or two, saying they were glad the restaurant was returning, that they hoped the staff were well, that they'd been thinking about a particular dish. Derek printed those notes and left them on the host stand, not as sentiment, but as information, the way he treated most things. Graham read through them during the pre-service walk, and then put them in the drawer below the pass without comment, but he read them. The kitchen ran the opening service with the same staff, the same menu structure, the same unhurried attention to the specific details that had always made the food what it was. Marcus arrived first and left last, the same as always. Nora ran the floor with the same efficiency and quiet authority she'd had since before Cassandra had ever walked through the door. The room filled at the pace it always filled, table by table, the low hum of conversation building gradually, until it reached the particular register that meant the evening was working. Not loud, not performative, just alive in the sustained way that a room only gets when the people in it feel that they've arrived somewhere that was made with care. Cassandra was not there that first night. She had been invited, and she had declined. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she understood that the reopening belonged to the people who had built and maintained and refused to give up the place, and her presence would have pulled the narrative in a direction that didn't serve that story. She was not the point of the evening. The restaurant was. She knew the difference now. She booked a reservation for the following month through the normal channel, the website, the wait list, 2 months out under her own name. Derek saw it in the system and noted it without action. Graham saw it when he reviewed the upcoming book on a Thursday morning, the way he reviewed everything, and set it aside and went back to his prep. Inside Ember Room, the 42 seats were full, and the kitchen was running, and Graham Cole was standing at the stove with his full attention on what was in front of him. Not because the world had become simpler, or because the things he had lost had been returned to him, or because grief had a resolution in the way that stories sometimes suggested it did, but because the act of feeding people with genuine care was still, after everything, the most honest thing he knew how to do, and honesty was worth showing up for. The light stayed on.